class. We're starting the lecture on Chapter 13, Pediatric Hearing Loss. I hope that before you have listened to the lectures, you've read the chapter. I hope specifically that you've read the introduction to this chapter regarding the miracle of hearing. Again, I know I've said this before, the author of your textbook is a frustrated poet in some way. This is just beautifully written. I'm not going to read it to you, but I please hope you will read it. So pediatric hearing loss, obviously the term pediatric means we're talking about children. I'll come back to that in a minute. Pediatric hearing loss refers to a condition in which a child or adolescent is unable to detect or distinguish the range of sounds normally available to the human ear. Those two words are important. Detect would refer more to can you actually hear it? Distinguishes can you tell it apart from other sounds? So it is part of the investigative work that we would do in terms of identifying and classifying a hearing loss. Much of the rest of what I'm going to say just in the next few minutes, not this whole lecture by any means, but in the next few minutes, would refer both to children and adults because it's talking about hearing loss in general. So keep that in mind. You'll hear me completely shift back to children at some point, but this beginning part refers to both, and we'll talk about adult hearing loss in chapter 14. For both, we're covering hearing loss as related to the outer and middle ear systems, the inner ear systems, and along the auditory nerve. Those represent three different kinds of hearing loss to a degree. Also, we'll talk about hearing loss that can be attributed to damage to the auditory processing centers of the brain, so more at the cognitive level. This type of loss is referred to as an auditory processing disorder or a central auditory processing disorder. You'll see it used synonymously in the literature about this. And it is truly more a disorder of that ability to distinguish than to detect. We're not going to talk about it a lot. Hearing loss is highly variable depending on where in the auditory system the dysfunction occurs, as well as if one or if both ears are affected. Also, the level of disability will depend on the level of hearing acuity affected. So that's more that can we detect hearing, and is it across all spectrums of hearing, the whole spectrum of hearing, or is it confined to high frequency, low frequency? I'm going to add from experience that the level of disability also varies based on things like an individual's temperament and their resiliency. We'll come back to that. Some hearing loss is present for only a short period of time, and other losses are persistent or permanent. When we talk about the different types of hearing loss, you'll see that a congenital hearing loss, a conductive hearing loss is almost always present just for a short period of time. But the other types of hearing loss are more permanent. So congenital, the word I used incorrectly a moment ago, a congenital hearing loss is one that is present at the time of birth. A prelingual hearing loss is one that occurs after birth, but before the development of language. So obviously all congenital hearing losses are also prelingual. A postlingual hearing loss is one that occurs after language skills are well established. So that's kind of a cloudy, if you will, a gray area. So for some people, that's in late childhood. For others, it's more into adolescence. But at that point, we treat a hearing loss much more as we would treat one for an adult, although now we have to consider the remainder of their educational experience. The term hearing loss is favored. It is the term that's used as opposed to hearing disorder or deafness. Again, it's part of that whole person forward thinking. But the reason we do it is it refers specifically to a degree of lost hearing as opposed to emphasizing disorder or impairment. As I said before, there are the level of disability, the level of impairment are based on many things, and the amount of hearing loss is just one of those things. So there are instances due to either the degree of the loss or life circumstances where a person with a hearing loss has little or no degree of handicap or impairment. So we don't always want to call this the term hearing disorder. The term deaf, so now small d, and again, we're still talking across the age spectrum here, children and adults. Small d, deaf, is reserved for persons with a severe or profound degree of hearing loss. When you see the term used with a capital D, it refers to someone who is a member of the deaf community. We're going to talk about that again in a little bit. So that term with the lowercase d refers to individuals with severe to profound loss who may or may not identify themselves with the capital D deaf community. With current early hearing detection and intervention, that's in parentheses, so early hearing detection and intervention is the name of programs that are in use now in most of the United States. Not every single state, I'm not sure why, but is used in most states. Data collection is able to find that a congenital hearing loss, so at the time of birth, occurs approximately 1 to 2 births in 1,000. So that early detection and intervention program happens in the hospital. Before a baby ever leaves the hospital, there's a hearing test done. So this is data collected from those hearing tests. That number, the 1 in 2 to 1,000, that number increases with the incidence of hearing loss that's acquired after birth. So approximately 20% of all school-age children have a hearing loss that is educationally significant. Now, sometimes that loss is temporary. For example, the hearing loss that comes along with having a middle ear infection, that's temporary, but they're included in that 20%. But sometimes that loss is permanent. But in either case, we're saying a hearing loss that's educationally significant. 20% is a lot of kids. 41% of children experience ongoing middle ear infections or chronic middle ear infections throughout their childhood. A middle ear infection typically results in a mild to moderate hearing loss. Now, it's not a permanent loss, but it's a hearing loss at the time. So if you think of a child that a number of times a year is experiencing a mild to moderate loss of hearing and still going to school and being expected to learn mostly via auditory information, it's important. It has educational relevance. The impact on communication is the major factor of hearing loss in determining levels of disability. And this is where things get tricky, because if communication is not compromised, then a hearing loss is not a huge disability. If, however, language development is compromised and language is not learned in a timely manner, then a hearing loss, even a mild to moderate hearing loss, can be a contributor to a lifelong disability. I'm going to add a bit more to this than what the text says about it. And I'll tell you about a student that I have worked with in the past. So, I'm sorry, I lost my place because my freeze grows on my other screen. Whether or not general communication is impacted by a hearing loss, even a mild hearing loss can have a significant impact on academic achievement if it's left unidentified. The earlier a hearing loss is identified, the more proactive a family can be in lessening the impact of communication development, the impact on communication development by taking advantage of interventions. So I want to tell you about a student that I had. Her name was Carrie, and Carrie became my student when she was in 5th grade, so fairly late in her elementary education. Her parents made a referral. Her grades in class were not good. They weren't. She wasn't failing anything, but she consistently was getting C's and D's. Now, C's, something you may not think about when you think about the whole A, B, C, D. C means you're doing average work. So kids with C's don't get aids. I'm sorry, don't get usually referred for assessment. But this little girl's parents knew there was something different. Um, she had they had taken her for private assessments years before. So starting in first grade, second grade, when she wasn't doing well academically, wasn't learning to read well, um, and that was the biggest area of weakness for her, was her reading ability. They had taken her for outside assessments. She'd had an outside speech language assessment that indicated her language skills were, you know, sufficient. They were average. They weren't great, but they were average, developing in the average range. Her speech skills, you could hear a little odd thing in her speech, but it was completely intelligible, not able to identify like a specific sound disorder. Um, they had even done some academic assessment outside of the school system that found average ability. So they probably looked at cognitive ability only. The one piece that was missing from these assessments, all of them outside, is the one piece I've told you must always be included in an assessment, and that was a hearing assessment. Now, in a hearing screening, she usually did okay, not great. She'd failed a few, in fact, in the public schools. She'd failed a few of the hearing screenings. But when an attempt had been made to repeat them, she was absent that day, or for whatever reason, this just fell through the cracks. So now I get a new referral, this little girl in fifth grade, and I'm finding the same thing everybody else did, that her language abilities are average. They're not great, they're average. Her academic skills are not where they should be. She has not made the kind of progress we would expect. But what the nurse found was a hearing loss. And she was able to repeat the hearing screening a couple weeks later. We always do that because it could have been just a bad day. And at that point, she referred her to our district audiologist, who was able to identify a moderate sensorineural hearing loss, which we'll get to what sensorineural means in a moment, but that was truly impacting this little girl's academics. And at that point, from that point forward, she had accommodations in her classroom. She had modifications to a degree. Eventually, she went to a junior high school within our district, a typical junior high, all the typical students there. But it was also a placement where we put all of our kids with hearing loss. So all of the teachers there used amplification in the classroom. There was specific support for kids with hearing loss on campus. So I'm saying all of this to make the point that we need to identify these losses as early as possible, because they will have lasting impact. They will have academic impact, even if it's a mild to moderate hearing loss. Okay, moving on. When a significant hearing loss is identified in an infant, now Carrie's wasn't a huge loss, but it had significant impact. We're talking a profound hearing loss is identified in an infant, the parents have to make a number of really important decisions, and they have to make them right away. And sometimes, or at least they should be making them right away. And often they are very uneducated about hearing loss in general. So one of the important decisions they need to make is they must choose a communication mode. And this is deciding how this child will communicate. Will they be an oral communicator? Will they use speech and lip reading? Or will they be a student who signs? The parents must also choose an orientation. So will this child just be part of the oral speaking community like most of the rest of us? Or will they become a member of the deaf community? And that means this family must also embrace that community. Now, the deaf community is not a specific place in the United States. Again, we'll talk about it again in a moment, but it doesn't mean their child is given away to some other group of people. But it is a decision that they need to make and should make as early as possible. Some statistics here: more than 80% of children that are born with hearing loss are born to parents with normal hearing. So you can see why those they don't have the resources, the education to make those decisions right away, but they need to get them and make those decisions as quickly as possible. Of children who are deaf and hard of hearing, only about 23% of them have family members that sign. So even if the parents choose for sign language to become this child's mode of communication, um, that statistic is staggering. Only 23% have family members who they can regularly communicate with or who are modeling development of sign language. Okay, the deaf community. The deaf community, it's a community of people throughout the United States, probably throughout the world, but we're only going to talk about the United States, who share attitudes regarding deafness, as well as a common language. So the community is based on this shared set of beliefs, and one of the strongest beliefs they hold is that deafness is an attribute, that it need not be a deficiency. They do not believe that being deaf needs to present any great area of disability to a person. Their shared language, obviously, is American Sign Language if they're in the United States. Members of the deaf community are typically opposed to the excessive use of assistive devices. So things like to the extreme of a cochlear implant, which we will again talk about again later. They're typically opposed to that because what that does is take a person who is deaf, who has profound hearing loss, and attempts to make them a hearing person. And if you have the value that being deaf can be an attribute and not a deficiency, why would you want to change that? Um, there's a wonderful movie that I'd like to recommend. Now, this one's not going to be easy to find, or it's not easy to find free. It was made, I believe, in the year 2000, and it's called Sound and Fury. I do know it is available on Amazon Prime, and it's also available on Sling, but on both of those platforms, it's available with an extra fee. So, like for example, Amazon Prime has a documentary uh, plan that it's an extra plan on top of Amazon Prime that you can sign up for, and it's included in that documentary. But what it is, it's about two families. They happen to be the two dads in the family are brothers, but two families who both have a child who is born deaf. And one of the dads is deaf himself, and one is not. And the movie is about this decision about whether their daughters will be getting cochlear implants or not. The families have different value systems, they have different beliefs about this. Even though these are brothers that were raised together, one was deaf. They were both raised sort of as part of the deaf community, but only one of them is deaf. Anyway, all complicating factors, but it's a great movie if you want to look more into this notion of the deaf community and their beliefs. And I highly recommend it if you have the opportunity. So, in the area of communication development, ideally, a child with a significant hearing loss will be identified before the age of 6 months of age. Identification later than the age of 6 months will likely result in that hearing loss having at least some adverse impact on language development. We know, think back way to our chapter on language development, that children's ability to start developing language happens right after they're born. They're wired for it already. So they need some system of language, whether it's spoken language or whether it's going to be American Sign Language. It needs to start happening right away. And if we have not even identified a hearing loss previous to that, then there's going to be some adverse impact on communication. Delays in development and the accompanying handicaps will have a huge range from mild to very severe, again, based on when it's identified, how severe the hearing loss itself is, what the family system is, all kinds of things. More significant delays will impact things like cognitive development and academic achievement. self-concept, social emotional well-being. Later in life, um, uh, a hearing impairment, sorry, I've got to log back in. A hearing impairment that has impacted speech and language or communication development may also impact vocational choices. So, speech language delays associated with hearing loss impact all of the domains of language, the content, the form, and use. So, we're going to break it down a little bit like that. So, in the area of semantics, content. In the area of content, vocabulary development will often be confined, or at least first confined, to major content words, so lacking words like adverbs and adjectives. The development of vocabulary is going to start with words that are representations of very concrete things. So a child who has significant hearing loss is first going to learn the words associated with concrete objects. So cat, right? Chair, cookie. Those are the words they're going to develop first. They may develop some associated action words as they're getting to that point of development where they're starting to combine words, but those associated action words are also going to be concrete and observable. So while we learned cat, we may learn scratch. While we learn dog, we might learn run. If we learn chair, we might learn the action word sit. So the very concrete development. What's going to take much longer to develop are those abstract action words, so things like think and love, things that we can't really see. Very general vocabulary, words such as furniture or animals. Much easier to just learn the names of all of the pieces of that grouping than it is to learn the name of the grouping or that concept. And then even more slow to develop will be the function words. So things like is and the and. We're going to come back to that in syntax. As they're continuing to acquire language, figurative language is problematic because these kids with hearing loss tend to be very concrete in their language development. So figurative language, like it's raining cats and dogs and time flies, those are very hard to learn and sometimes have to be very explicitly taught. And our literature is full of those kind of phrases. In the area of syntax, often children with hearing loss will be very slow to acquire the grammatical markers that indicate changes in word form. So the ed endings, ing, the s, plural s, and possessive s. And this is because those are at the end of a word, right? So they tend to be on unstressed syllables, where both pitch and loudness tend to drop. If a child were learning the sign system called Signing Exact English, they would learn some of those. So, for example, I'm going to hold my hands up here higher. The sign for walk, if we wanted to say walking, we would say walking, or wanted to say walked, walked, and we throw it over our shoulder into the past. But those are not typical in American Sign Language. So, one, not only can a child with hearing loss hear those word endings, they also are not in their sign system, even if they're learning American Sign Language. Now, they learn tensing based on context, different thing. But it does impact academic success. So in an ASHA convention that I attended a number of years ago, I heard research that was saying what they were finding is that abilities with syntax are critically important to the development of reading comprehension and of spelling skills. So even though American Sign Language has its own kind of syntax, we're still reading written English, and we need to comprehend written English. So that development of syntax becomes important. It becomes important not only in learning to read, but then also in understanding subjects like social studies and science due to the use of decontextualized language, which we've talked about a number of times. So, decontextualized language, talking about things in the past, talking about things in the present, things not present in the room with us, things in the future, um, is best expressed through changes in word form, like the past tense markers and the future tense markers. In the area of pragmatics, so we've done content, we've done form. In the area of use, children with hearing loss, especially if it's an unidentified hearing loss, or even if it's identified and they're wearing hearing aids aren't perfect. Kids with hearing loss tend to miss out on some subtle conversational cues. So they either don't learn some of the rules of social conversation, or they appear to have not learned them. Also, communication in a group is problematic because of the signal to noise ratio. If you recall what that is, the signal is the person you're speaking to within the group, or the person who is speaking within the group. And then the noise is all of the other sound around it, either little offside conversations, or the movement of chairs, the movement of people around the group. And again, this can result in improper learning of the expectations, or the appearance of having not learned expectations of group communication. So pragmatics can be an issue.